How's it going?
Hey,
Hi.
hello.
Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yee.
dope. Um, yeah, this is really happening really quickly. I didn't actually think I'd be able to talk to you. That's pretty dope.
Yeah, no, I mean,
Um,
I'm trying to make basically the way that I do streaming, like, as accessible to people who want to talk to me as possible. So, yeah.
awesome, awesome. Okay. Yeah, I guess just a quick explanation of where I'm coming from. I didn't have any deep knowledge about trans activism, and but I've been really into philosophy for about five years or so.
Mm-hmm.
I did a math undergrad, and yeah, I really liked political philosophy and all that stuff. Anyways, I just fell down a rabbit hole listening to your content, and I've really changed my views, and just very fascinating. Like, I really enjoy it.
Well, damn, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, I hope it's useful. Yeah, no, so I appreciate it. Um, yeah, so go ahead. Sorry.
No, no, no. So yeah, I mean, it seems like a really interesting philosophical like area. The activism, specifically like the trans activism that you're involved with, it seems really challenging and not intuitive at times.
Mm-hmm.
I
Well,
know
or sorry, go ahead.
I know I've had my mind changed quite radically. Like, I will be honest and say that I was compelled by a lot of very simplistic sort of Ben Shapiro type views
Mm-hmm.
in the past, and I thought it was like obviously correct. And then just listening to a lot of your content has been really interesting.
Damn, thank you. Sorry, I'm also eating
Yeah,
dinner, but I hope you don't mind. I just had to. I've
not
been
at
running
all.
around all day. But yeah,
Not at
no,
all.
I look, yeah, no, I appreciate it. Obviously, mm, just say a word or two. All right, I'll stop eating for a bit.
Do you want me to say a word?
Or yeah, sure, go for it.
Sorry, you said say a word or two. I
Oh
don't.
no, no, I
You
was gonna
mean?
say just for me to say a word or two on that. Yeah, no, I definitely
Oh yeah.
no, I definitely think that like Ben Shapiro and a lot of people on the right have kind of like monopolized the idea of being like factually accurate or like being intellectual or whatever, like almost as if it's like this quality that only they share, and it's almost like a politicized quality. And I don't like that. I think that there are a lot of people who are on kind of like the left or who do different kinds of activism related to what I do, who do good work, but I don't know. I found that this has been very useful for me, both for my own kind of soul searching, but also just for, being able to like provide like some degree of counter narrative, like other larger people have done before me. So yeah, no, I get you.
Yeah, I think you're doing the right thing. You have a very sharp attitude, which is fun, like to listen to as well. Um,
I try to be joyful, yeah. Or I don't know, like I like being here. I like talking. I like doing what I do. So yeah, thank you.
yeah, so this is cool. I will admit though that I am new to this, so I am
Hmm.
gonna say things that sound like I just don't know what I'm talking about. So if I ask you a question, always interpret it as a noob asking a question, and not
Hmm.
like um, in any other way.
Yeah, don't worry. Yeah, if you say anything like wrong or if you phrase something weird, I'll let you know. Like there's no judgment here.
Awesome, awesome. Oh yes, and the only reason I have Discord is because I was listening to some of Destiny stuff. So that's sort of the context of me listening to people
So did you
talk
get to
about
know
things.
him before me or me before him?
Him before you.
Hmm. Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, that
Yeah,
seems to be much more that's much more likely, right? Significantly larger creator. So yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
yeah. I'm a debate junkie, so I actually come from the like old school atheism, like 2005 YouTube debate. I think that's where I got
Hmm.
my interest in this. So when I'm on YouTube, I'm like looking for debates, and then I just like hit your channel, and I was like, holy shit, there's a lot of content. So that's where the
Yeah,
rabbit hole.
yeah. I mean, like I don't know. I definitely enjoy debate or like just talk. I don't know. Usually, I'm trying to do this more because like sometimes I can be a little hot headed, but usually I try to be like kind of like laid back and then like you know, if someone wants to make it into a debate, it'll become a debate. But I just, you know, I prefer just like by default, just like chatting and talking to people. I feel like you can usually have much more productive conversations that way. Obviously, if people, you know, do things like act in bad faith, or like are being deliberately obtuse, or you know, are like trying to directly ad hom or whatever, you know, then we can get a little spicier from there. But as a rule, I mean, I think that most people are kind and just kind of want to learn.
Yeah. I hope that's how I come across. You know, I don't have like a YouTube channel. I don't debate people publicly, so I'm gonna be a little bit, you know, stumbling and stuff. So yeah, just and I'm also out of my depth. So, anyways, I wanted to ask you about something a bit general,
Mm-hmm.
um, because it seems to me that when I hear people talk about trans rights, it seems like it comes from a bigger picture of human expansion of diverse behavior.
Hmm.
So it seems like human beings, you know, we come from a limited set of behaviors, right? I mean, if you go back 10,000 years, you're not going to see a lot of diversity. You're not going to see painters, and you know, you're not going to see people who are making iPads and who are, you know, dancing. You're going to see people who are hunting and gathering, right? You're going to see, you know, everyone is, you know, in a heterosexual situation. People don't live past the age of 40. Divorce is probably not a concept, you know, like ownership of things. So anyway, so there's a very like limited set of um of behaviors, and so now what we're observing is people are essentially expanding that horizon and saying, like, you know, hey, how come we have to have men and women get married? Why not allow, you know, two men to be married, for example? And then we explore that and we think about that. So the question I wanted to ask you is, given your activism and your philosophy in this topic, where else do you see expansion of human diversity that reaches past uh, um, trans rights? So, for example, I know you talked about like this might sound funny, but like furries. You talked about some other things, and I just
Hmm.
wanted to hear from you, like other things where you see expansion as being critical for
Yeah.
human progress.
So I mean, also I'm getting a little bit of feedback. Now, I can't hear it now, so I think it's fine. But yeah. So essentially, like, I see a couple areas kind of that are tentatively on my radar for the future, right? Um, I think that a lot of like, I think that some people might think that like, oh, you know, neopronouns or like alternative forms of gender expression beyond just binary, or like exploring more about what non-binary means is like what's most immediately in front of us. Um, I'm personally of the impression that like the next really big, because usually like a lot of these expansions of civil rights and understandings usually come from, at least from the way that I've seen it, some kind of new revelation about like an intrinsic quality of the self, right? That's not always necessarily the case, but when we're talking about things like LGBT rights, like that's usually to me kind of like the thing that leads to discoveries or broadenings in that area, as far, or like big cultural changes, right? Is like recognizing that there's been like a group of people or a quality or a trait that's always been present, but because it may have not been like advantageous, that quality, or it may have been shunned, or it may have, you know, because like you mentioned, like culture has been pretty homogenous throughout the course of history for one reason or another. And so a lot of these qualities may be shunned in people, even though they are themselves benign or neutral, right? Trans people are an example of that, right? Like they've existed over the course of history and they've manifested in a lot of different cultures, especially like non-binary identities. But for a lot of history, it's either been shunned or it hasn't been taken seriously, or it's been such just a small number of people, um, that society really hasn't had any reason to take record or notice, at least in a large scale. And so, like, when we're talking about where I see things going forward, I think that, like, alternative forms of gender and, like, really getting into the nuance of what non-binary means is definitely something that's out there. I think kind of exploring, like, different forms of gender expression and identity. Because, like, right now, we kind of accept non-binary as an idea, but, like, all that means is, like, that's just, like, an umbrella term to describe any gender that is not man or woman, right? But that doesn't necessarily that's not necessarily a category itself. Well, I mean, like it is. It's an umbrella term. It's like a collection of identities, right? And so we're probably going to be kind of like figuring out what some of those might look like, what are the ones that end up manifesting, and how our society kind of deals with that in turn, right? Sports are a really good example because I've been talking about sports a lot lately. Now, a lot of the times when we're talking about like trans people in sports, people tend to focus on like trans women, but non-binary people adds a whole nother level to this, right? And it's like, all right, well, how do you deal with having competitions where you now have to include people who fit into neither of the main two categories, at least perfectly, right? I think in the short term, we're probably going to have to just like make like a really kind of like a non-ideal kind of solution where essentially, also hold on, I'm going through a trial that I've never done before. This is great. But essentially, I think that we're probably going to have a not so perfect solution in the short term. That being, we'll probably have something like, people can be able to choose one of several, like people can be able to basically like opt into either within certain parameters. But like we're going to have to like really deal with larger questions of, we're going to really have to deal with larger questions like this in the future, and like how to integrate non-binary identities more into mainstream culture. Because like, it's kind of out of Pandora's box at this point, right? Like non-binary people are recognized enough in larger society that, we're going to probably have to like redefine a lot of what our culture is around the recognition of this category of people. Another area that I see a lot of probably like cultural shifts in development of knowledge, or like the development of our understanding. And this is like maybe the hot take, or this might be like a hot take, but it's just because like I've noticed it. I think that like discussions of people who have DID is also going to really take off. Are you familiar with people? Are you familiar with that?
No.
Okay, so that's dissociative identity disorder. And it's interesting because essentially like, a lot of people probably, have like some kind of cultural familiarity with this idea. It's portrayed often negatively in a lot of movies. It's actually very, like, there's a lot of like overlaps between like that kind of quality and like being trans or otherwise LGBT, insofar as like how normally society treats that category of person. And so like here, and so to be able to summarize essentially it is a condition where essentially, and I believe that the way that it goes over is from an early age for most people who are affected by this, there is a event, like some kind of triggering event, which causes alternative personalities, like distinct personalities, to develop in the mind, right? And this gets into a really weird question. Like we have it. Oh, hold on. Hey, RGR, just a heads up. I created a text track directly. Oh, nice. Thank you. I appreciate it. But yeah, like essentially you have like, it's the multiple brains or multiple people in one body, right? And it creates this really interesting idea of, do we give like civil rights and recognition to like these different distinct persons, or like how do we treat these people? And I don't have a perfect answer for this, but like it's one of those ideas where it's like now we're starting to define what is consciousness. Very similar or like related to this is going to be a question of like artificial intelligence, right? Like once we get to a point where we're able to like actually create fully sentient artificial intelligence, we're going to have to figure out like, all right, well, what does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to have rights? What does it mean to be human? Animal rights will probably also take on a quality around these kind of developments, right? Like as we start expanding the idea of like what deserves rights and recognition. But essentially we start getting out of like a lot of this conversation is going to be probably centered around, at least in my opinion, like what do we as a society determine deserves rights and recognition, right? With trans people...
Absolutely.
Yeah, so like with trans people, it's like, do trans people deserve rights and recognition pursuant to and relating to their trans identity? Same for all LGBT people. And then if we want to like narrow it, like, do we want to give specific non-binary identities rights and recognition by virtue of the fact that they have that identity? And then, do we want to give people who have DID specific rights and recognition, especially pertaining to their different identities? And then do we want to give AI, right? Like a lot of this is going, and then like there's AI and then there's animals. Like a lot of this is just going to be like figuring out like who do we want to recognize as worthy of rights, you know? And I don't have a great answer for that.
That's a philosophically like brutally challenging and also incredibly important question, because it pretty much, that's how we get the worst atrocities, is we answer that question wrong.
Yep.
Right.
Oh yeah. No, we determined. Yeah, this group does not deserve rights. Yeah. I mean, like look through like basically any major atrocity through history. The easiest one is obviously like the Holocaust, right? It's like, oh yep, these various groups of people, they don't deserve rights. They're not human in the way that you and I are. We're the special people. We're the true race.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating. That's an extreme example, of course, but even just the way Black people were treated in America is interesting, because it seems so coherent that they were a completely different class, despite I mean obviously today we know there's just so little to substantiate that kind of insane partition, but humans were able to rationalize this. Obviously they created the partition, right? If you don't allow people to learn how to read, then you're going to have an illiterate class and a literate class, and now there is a difference. But we know that of course Black people can read just as any other race can read.
Right.
But it's fascinating, because we could just invent these cases. I'm actually familiar with AI and theory of mind and all this stuff. It seems extremely complicated. Deciding at one point does a computer matter? It's a really just weird. And like, I think it's considered one of the hardest questions, is consciousness.
It's definitely up there,
Yeah, so I guess my question to you is, let's put specifically transactivism aside, and let's just talk about the broader question of deciding who to give rights to. What kind of criteria do you think matter for making that call? It's a very tough call, because you mentioned animals, right? I mean, some people would argue that animals are currently facing a Holocaust, if they matter. If they don't matter, then it's just food production.
Yeah,
So
I mean, like this is
how
hard
do we make
because
that call?
this is hard because I know if I answer it wrong, then the vegans are going to come out of the woodwork, and that's just a battle I really don't want to fight right now. Usually,
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, usually right now I'm trying to limit the scope of what I do just to focus primarily on people, like on human organisms. I understand that like there's probably something beyond that. I understand that like we can probably expand, like, and we probably will have to expand the idea of who and what deserves rights beyond that at some point based on our like developed understanding. I think that like just like as a prudential matter for me, it's important to like narrow the scope, because otherwise like because otherwise I get into an issue where like I'm trying to cover like so many different kinds of civil rights that I end up not being able to like adequately argue for like the few that are most important or like most easily achievable, I should say.
Absolutely. So if we stick to human beings, because I think that makes a lot of sense. The question I would ask is, we can agree that it's not about the number of people that make up that minority class, right?
Yeah.
If it's a minority of one, it doesn't mean we should strip rights or dehumanize that person. I guess the question is, within the confines of human beings, how do you define a behavior, a diversity of behavior, as deserving of rights and protection? What kind of
quality? Usually, well, I mean, I don't know. There's a couple different ways you could take this, right? Because like, normally we could probably think of it in terms of like different kinds of categorizations, right? I think that the easiest one is to focus on like the easiest categorization for civil rights and recognition, I would say, is like an intrinsic quality, right? A lot, like, for example, at least in my understanding of like most LGBT identities, like the unifying factor among all of them is that they're an intrinsic quality. They're not something that you choose. You can choose how to be able to express them, and obviously like your understanding of them, and those things may change over the course of your life. But at the end of the day, it's not like you just choose to be. It's not like you just like are like, today I just feel like being straight. I'm gonna turn on a dating app and I'm gonna just go find a guy or a guy or a gal or whoever. It's like, or I just choose to be gay. Like most people, and I can't say all because this has gotten to a recent controversy, but most people I would say would probably say that like being LGBTQIA plus is not like a choice, you know, it's an intrinsic quality. And I would say for people with intrinsic qualities that that's like a pretty easy, we should consider heavily giving them civil rights, because it doesn't make sense to like allow people in society to disparately treat people with those intrinsic qualities negatively on the basis of something that they didn't choose to begin with, right? So that's kind of the first layer. The second layer, because like if you want to take the position, now there are some people who would argue, and I would vehemently disagree with this position, but if there's some people who would say that being LGBT or having some other similar or related qualities is not a choice, one way you could make the argument for people in those kind of positions or for other related rights is to argue that we should advocate rights which most maximize bodily autonomy. And that just requires like a fundamental shift in how we understand giving rights to people. But essentially, the idea would be you want to give rights to people so that they could most like have the most control over their own individual person as possible. It's kind of like taking Mill's harm principle and like maximizing it to like taking it to like the nth degree. And the reason why is because that's probably, well, I mean, like if we want to talk about things like abortion, that's probably the best argument there. Because if we're talking about, like if, for example, if we take abortion as like a, a discussion about, like, and we try to fit that into a framework of what's like inherent or necessary, maybe we change it into like a medical necessity kind of framework. Abortion doesn't often win out, right? At least voluntary abortions, like in instances where the mother is not at dangerous risk, or the person with the uterus. And so like in those kind of instances, you probably want a different framework. Not to say you can't advocate for it, but it would probably be better to focus on one which maximizes bodily autonomy. Those are like entirely different kind of like fundamental perspectives on what we value as a society. Because if we take a kind of perspective of maximizing bodily autonomy, then you start getting into some people would say bad. I'm not gonna like disparate. I'm not gonna like disparately describe these things. I'm just gonna say interesting. You get into some really interesting inferences. Like suddenly it becomes a right. It becomes like a human right to get tattoos because you want to maximize bodily autonomy, or it becomes or like usually like the easiest example is to go to like most cosmetic surgeries. Now,
or maybe even taking drugs, I'm guessing.
Maybe. Yeah, that's possible. I could see that. Now, I think that, like, here's the thing about it, is that I think from, like, an advocacy perspective, the inherent quality is easier to advocate for. A lot of people, because, like, a lot of people can get behind the idea that, like, okay, being LGBT is not a choice, it's just who you are. Therefore, we should, like, not discriminate against you. Like, a lot of people can easily understand that one. I think that, like, insofar as, or, like, as far as, like, which provides the better outcomes on the whole, I think that the bodily autonomy, the bodily autonomy one probably wins out. Although I don't think that it's easy to advocate for that one. The reason why is because, especially when we get into ideas of like healthcare and like, trans people being like the quickest example, we get into like immediate questions of like, all right, well, what's just cosmetic and what is medically necessary, right? I recently had to deal with this because I got top surgery. I would argue that was medically necessary. I would say that like it was medically necessary for me to be able to alleviate gender dysphoria and be able to live a full and healthy life and all that. But the health insurance didn't buy that. They said no, based on the totality of the evidence that we've evaluated, we would say that's purely cosmetic. And so that's actually, kind of the or sorry, what?
Can I this is something I just would love to kind of delve into a little bit deeper here, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm.
So you just talked about how we want to avoid tampering with intrinsic qualities of individuals, right? We don't want to dampen or hurt something that someone cannot change. And further, we want to maximize bodily autonomy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, like those are two different frameworks, right?
Right.
Like I would say that those are like two different goals, which can often conflict in the way that, like, for example, in the way I'm describing right now, right? Like if you have a system organized around, not discriminating against people with intrinsic qualities, often legislatively you get into a question of trying to determine what is an intrinsic quality, right? And that can be a drawback. So like it can be easier to implement that kind of a framework, but it can often get into problems where it can be difficult to determine what is an intrinsic quality.
Right, absolutely. So let me ask you this, right? So suppose you have a woman
Mm-hmm.
who has, you know, as an example, like in her own mind, disproportionately small breasts, for example. Like she believes that something she really feels is important to her, but she doesn't have that, and she has to live a life where she has to deal with that, confronting the fact that society values these aesthetic things, and so she
Mm-hmm.
decides she wants to get a surgery. I'm curious how you would differentiate, or how you would think about this versus your case.
Um,
Obviously your case is much more important in a mental health and well-being way, but there seems to be something still important about this lady example,
uh,
and I'm just curious about your thoughts there.
well, I'm pretty sure that like a version of that does exist in like the medical field. What is that like? Oh, they're like body. Well, I mean, it's similar to dysphoria. It's like dysmorphia, right? It's like the idea that like some people may have like vastly disproportionate perceptions of their own body, like to the point where it can be diagnosed at like a psychological level. There, not entirely sure what the practice is. To my knowledge, and this is only based on like what I can glean, the way that you probably want to deal with that is to first engage in like and I'm about to say this and I'm gonna like give an immediate caveat because someone could take it out of context and like try to use it as like an argument against or for some really bad positions. But the first thing that you probably want to do is engage in like some kind of therapy with that person, like at least to some degree, and kind of see if that can be resolved at that point. And then if it can't, like I'm pretty sure that some people, like depending on the kind of procedure that's being asked for, you can probably cover it under medical insurance if it's something that like can't be resolved through therapy, and like that person, and like it's demonstrated that like it's not going to go away unless there's some other kind of medical intervention. Now I'm going to give a caveat there because like that's a kind of argument that could be very easily misinterpreted to be used as an argument for advocating conversion therapy, right? Basically, the idea that like, oh well, trans people, we should try to put them through therapy to try and convert them into normal cis people. But the problem with this is
Right.
that like we've already like throughout the entire history of conversion therapy, we've only observed that not only has it not worked, but it's actually caused disproportionately much more harm to LGBT people than any possible well-being, if any, that it's caused, right? Whereas like with other forms of therapy, like dealing with or like body dysmorphia, like there's a decent amount of evidence that shows that it probably works.
Okay. Yeah, really interesting things. I mean, from where I'm sitting, I kind of get this intuition that we really want to promote people exploring diversity of behaviors. Like we don't want to say, oh, that behavior isn't important or isn't
Yeah.
worthy.
Oh,
Like I feel like we want to kind of expand. So if
yeah.
like
Sorry, go
if
ahead.
anything, we want to be very quick, or we want to be very slow to say no to pretty much anything.
Yeah, like I tend to agree with that. Like I think that so like with the example that we described, I mean like it's kind of I don't know, like in that example, like what we described, it's probably a little bit different from like the idea that you might be trying to capture, just because like essentially we're describing someone who experiences like a discernible harm, and then so the idea is like, all right, so we want to like reduce the harm that they experience, and so what's the best way to be able to do that? But as far as like maximizing bodily autonomy, like I do think that we probably want to try and move towards a society which is more focused on that kind of an idea, like along the lines of what you described, right? I'm just not sure if we're quite there yet, because most of the time when we're talking about ideas of like, oh, how are we going to be able to maximize the different kinds of expression, or maximize the different kinds of expressions of people, like oftentimes when we're talking about like exploring different varieties of expressions and like types of self-expression and identity that are not normal or mainstream, oftentimes they're regulated to like the fringes of society. One of the examples that comes to my mind is like the idea of people being like furries or otherkin. Like these people are like ridiculed and like pushed into like the furthest corners of the internet, because otherwise they're ridiculed by society, you know? And like, I'm not sure, there's no more, like, I'm not putting any moral claim on that kind of an identity, but that's the way that our society treats those kinds of expressions, which I would say is a bad thing to do. Like, we don't want to like negatively or disparagingly treat someone just because they have like this, like a certain form of expression that deviates from the norm if that expression doesn't otherwise harm people or infringe on other people's rights or liberties. And so like we're probably going to need like a much more fundamental shift in how we kind of do society to achieve what you're looking for, but I think it's a good thing to strive for.
So one concern is that it seems that it's really about the numbers. If you have a minority that's large, you're more likely to get your opinion as accepted, right? There are a few exceptions here, but yeah, the big issue, the big risk is that you are part of a very small minority.
Yeah,
Because,
but I mean, or sorry, go ahead.
well, I mean, it just seems like you're it's like going to court without a lawyer. Like you're kind of screwed because you don't have anyone who's going to stand up for you. The fact that, for just as an example, like gay people make up a good percentage of the population, which means they have a huge percentage of the population has a friend or family member that's gay, if they're not gay themselves. That means that you have a pretty big army of people that are willing to stand up for you. But again, if you're an otherkin, for example, then it seems like, if you're in a small group, you're our society definitely values numbers more than like philosophical
Yeah,
reasoning.
but I mean, like, this is why I tend to like focusing on especially gender, but other kind of like socially constructed categories through the idea of intersubjectivity, because like when we're looking at the way that society largely thinks about certain ideas, ultimately the way that you change those over time are by trying to change the way that the average reasonable person in a certain space or society conceives of a certain idea, right? Trans people, like, let's just say like 5 to 10 years ago, largely considered by the average reasonable person in society, whether they didn't know about trans people to begin with, or what they did know was to the extent that they were aware of them, they probably had this idea of like a man in a dress in the back of their mind, right? And that's probably all they thought about. They didn't think about trans men. They didn't think about non-binary people. They didn't think about trans people who could possibly pass or integrate in society. It's just like those that like they only had one idea in their head at best, and it was a very negative one, right? But as we've seen over time, as a lot of people have, oh God, hold on, I need to go here. Okay, I went here. But as we've seen over time, a lot of people have, because we've been able to engage in as much widespread activism and advocacy as we have, as kind of not only as trans people, but like also the allies of trans people, that have been acquired over time. We've kind of been able to expand the idea or change the average reasonable person's interpretation of what it means to be trans, and therefore like to be a gender in general, in the entirety of society, right? Like nowadays, it's not only more accepted to be trans, but it's also like, it's also able to be respected, right? Like now we have like elected leaders who are able to go out and be openly trans and be able to like lead meaningful, fulfilling lives in the public eye, right? Being treated as who they are, not even just like, oh, trying to think of an example. Like there could have been a hypothetical universe where you have someone who is trans, who is just like such a good leader that everyone loves them, but like they still live in a very transphobic society, so no one actually treats them as the gender they are. They're just like, all right, so like we're gonna respect you, we're gonna listen to you, but like, we're otherwise still gonna acknowledge, we're still gonna like misgender you because we don't buy like that part, but everything else about you we believe. Like no, we live in a society where like you can be a leader and be trans and be treated, you can be respected and like treated as who you are, but that's a result of like a large movement to change how the entirety of our society views trans people. And we can probably do the same with like any other category, right? It's just like a matter of networking, convincing people, and being able to demonstrate like, hey, this is a thing, and it should be respected. And that can apply to any category of persons, right? I have no idea what furries and otherkin and people with DID and, you know, artificial intelligence. Like, I have no idea how these different categories are going to be treated by society in the future. But I mean, like, while these different categories may not be treated with the respect that they may deserve in the short term, that doesn't mean that we can't get there. It's just a matter of, like, doing the work of changing how larger society treats those categories. Does that make sense? I'm sorry,
absolutely.
I know that was a lot.
No, not at all. It's good. It's good. It makes it easier if you do most of the talking. Absolutely. I mean, just expanding on that. Yeah, because I think the biggest thing. So, as my mind is being changed, mostly what I feel is being changed is how I perceive trans people.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I feel like I say that I don't have any baggage, I don't have any animosity, but as I'm listening to what you're saying, in your other videos, I realize that I'm actually having my mind changed in terms of what I believe, in terms of my perceptions. I think perceptions are a big deal. So, for example, things like what you said about like just a man in a dress, right?
Mm-hmm.
I definitely think I felt that way before. And it's definitely not something that anyone reasoned into me. It's just the societal sort of picture that people paint, and it does damage. If I could ask one question, which I worry that you answer a lot, but I'm still going to ask it, and you can say no if you don't want to answer it. But what is the big picture of the harm of a society that simply refuses to accept trans philosophy? So a society that says no, you're still a man even though you've transitioned and you say you're a woman. Like, we will let you have all the bodily autonomy. You can have surgeries, you can wear what you like, but we refuse on that deeper level to philosophically onboard with your opinion. I'm just curious. I'm sure you've
Mm-hmm.
answered this a ton of times, but what's the damage look like for that society?
Yeah, so there's a couple, right? I mean, like, I've been asked like different varieties of this question, but essentially there are a couple things, right? The first is that like there's an immediate, it's like in the first thing that comes to mind is that there's kind of an immediate tacit acknowledgement that like we as a society then are making the determination that there are certain intrinsic qualities that we are fine discriminating against, which seems to go counterintuitive with the way that we do a lot of like recognition of human rights in our society currently. Like, that's why I mentioned earlier that like having a framework which acknowledges like human rights as being linked to intrinsic qualities is often the easiest, because like that's what our society is primarily based on right now, and so like we kind of are making that determination as a society that like now there are some intrinsic qualities that people have that we're willing to discriminate against, even if those people aren't largely causing harm to others. So like that's the first thing, right? Is that it seems to go counterintuitive to the way that we largely do society.
Right.
And then the second thing on top of that is that then, as far as like the specifics of gender, well then we're getting into like really weird then essentially like we're trying to implicitly draw other lines for what it means to be a man and a woman. And so naturally, like the reason why trans people are valid, at least in like an intersubjective sense or like a societally constructed sense, is because like the super duper TLDR, if you've seen like Blair White or even like me, like I'm able to go out in society and everyone genders me correctly. All right. Like I go out, everyone's like she, her, all that good stuff. And like,
Right.
if you want to say that doesn't at least make someone a woman in the socially constructed sense, then you are essentially, then essentially you have to acknowledge, like you're going to have some other criteria for what it means to be a woman. And usually this is where like TERFs and second wave feminists will fall back on like biological sex, right? And like,
Right.
and so what you end up doing there is you will boil the entirety of like being a man or being a woman down to your reproductive quality, which is,
Right.
I would say, like a bad way to view gender. like strictly in terms of like your ability to be able to reproduce or engage in reproductive functions. But that's what you would entail if you say that, like, for example, trans people are not who they say they are, because then you would be arguing implicitly that there's some other, like, the basis for that claim. And the basis that most people cite is that, oh, because gender is the same as biological sex, or is based directly on biological sex, which can lead to a lot of, like, really bad, like, essentially would lead to, like, reductio ad absurdums, right? You would say that people who everyone in society treats as a woman is not a woman, or people that everyone treats as a man is not a man. For example, like passing trans people, like those people you would just, like, even though every single person in society would treat that person as a gender that they identify with, we would just say, like, nope, fuck that. It's going to be super inconvenient for everyone, but we're going to look down your pants to see what gender you are.
Right.
Sucks. Or like the super I mean, like, I would say that this is, like, the ridiculous version of this argument, but this is actually what what someone has suggested to me before in a conversation. When we get into conversations about bathrooms, someone suggested, who basically believes kind of this line of thought, right, that gender is strictly, well, that the only thing that matters is biological sex in determining whether or not someone is a man or a woman. And what you get into, like, the situations you get into is, like, in conversations about bathrooms, and especially trans people who pass, this person, like a person who I talked to, unironically said the way that we should be able to, the way that we determine someone, like the gender of someone who goes into a bathroom, whether or not they're a man or a woman, is by looking in their genitals at the door, right? And, like, obviously we don't want to have genital checkers outside of every single bathroom, right? Like, eventually this starts to get just fucking ridiculous. Other really good examples, I mean, like, usually that's, like, the best one. Oh, but then we also start getting into, like, other really good examples where it's like, if people can't engage in reproductive functions, or if they fall in some way outside of the norm, but they're otherwise still treated as, like, the gender that they identify with, well, now we can't define those people with the gender they identify with, or the gender that everyone treats them as. So, like, if you're a woman but you had your uterus removed for whatever reason, maybe you were having cancer and you had to have it removed, well, are you not a woman anymore? Well, you can't engage in reproductive functions. So, like, some people might just, like, have to bite the bullet and say, well, sorry, you ain't a woman anymore. You're something else. Maybe you're just a fucking eunuch now. Doesn't matter how society treats you. SOL, friendo. Or similarly for, like, men who become incompetent. I remember there was, like, one conversation where it was, like, Sargon of Akkad essentially made the, someone was like, all right, listen, if a man becomes incompetent, are you actually going to say that they aren't a man anymore?
You mean impotent or incompetent?
Or impotent, sorry. Unable to...
too many men are incompetent. It'd be difficult to run that.
Sorry. If men become impotent, right? Then, and so, like, essentially the conversation went to, so, Sargon, are you saying that, like, if a man becomes impotent, then they're no longer a man anymore? And I believe that his response was essentially, well, they certainly lost something, didn't they? And it's like, no! Are you kidding me? And it's like, and that's when you get into, like, a lot of these ridiculous instances, right? Because then you start, like, doing some really hard line drawing based off of, like, some strict biological essentialism. So, like, not only, so basically to summarize all of that, not only are you going to end up, like, kind of going against our, like, a large understanding in society of who deserves rights based on, like, intrinsic qualities, but you're also, on the basis of that kind of a decision, probably going to get in a lot of, like, really, really dicey situations of, like, doing some arbitrary line drawing for who is and who is not, like, authentically a man or a woman based on, like, some biological criteria.
Wow. Okay. I mean, that's a great answer to the question for sure. Okay. I wanted to slightly pivot and ask about something that might sound like a dumb question, but, you know, if you take a biology class, for example, and you study, let's take a zoology class, right? You're studying animals, and often, like, if you have pets, you hear people say, like, oh, this dog is a boy, this dog is a girl.
Oh, yeah.
We're studying birds. This is the female has this and the male has that. I'm just curious how you think about this in the framework that you have.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I've definitely thought about this before. People who are watching me right now probably may have never thought about this, but these are the kind of questions that keep me up at night. For example, like, I have a turtle, Shelly, and, like, I wonder, like, all right, how do I gender Shelly? Shelly has laid eggs, so, like, by most criteria, we would say biologically male or so, like, we would, like, call Shelly biologically female.
Okay.
Here's the thing about it, and this might be, like, an unsatisfying answer. Essentially, like, I think at this point, at least looking at human biology, because like a lot of the literature seems to be moving away from a like clearly defined definition of like biological sex based off of like chromosomes or gamete production or some other like binary criteria, and seems to be moving in a different direction. I have no idea how that's going to apply to animals, but I mean, I know that there's a lot of literature on the fact that like biological sex, like for as varied as it is in people, it's crazy in a lot of animals. And so like, I don't know how we're going to do it. We can probably assume a lot of the same kind of like, construction of gender qualities and identities that we have for people onto animals insofar as we treat them, right? Like, we gender animals and we treat them as if they have human qualities, even though they clearly don't, you know? Like, you know, there are lots of people who, like, and you can imagine this person, right? Like, we all probably know that person who dresses up their dog in like a sweatshirt, even though there's literally no purpose for putting on that sweatshirt, or the person who like takes pictures of their cat with like a baseball cap, or a dog with their baseball cap or whatever. Like, people do like gendered shit with animals and treat them like consistent with that gender like all the time, even though the animal probably doesn't give a fuck.
Or if anything, it doesn't like it.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, I don't know, like I think that the best answer right now is like, we can probably like, there's probably no harm in assuming that animals have certain gender identities, or like that we could we can like sex those animals for most purposes. The reason why we get into more nuanced discussions with like humans lately is because usually, so like, especially if we're approaching this from like a utilitarian or like a scientific anti-realist kind of an approach, you know, we want to be able to have the definitions or the criteria which offer us like the most utility and consistent outcomes. Usually, like with sexing animals, like having a simple binary is fine most of the time. As far as I'm aware, I'm not like an animal biologist, but I mean, just from like you know, not knowing that much about the subject matter. But like for people, it gets a little bit different because like, you know, we're a lot more focused on like the categorization, health, and well-being of people than we are animals most of the time. That's just my
also because
go ahead.
Because human beings have expanded the horizon of possibility, right? I mean, we don't like, you know, animals for the most part are struggling to make basic needs met, and we have a, you know, an expanded horizon. We don't look at a dolphin and say, oh, this dolphin is a physicist and that dolphin, you know, loves to paint, and like, no, we just say these dolphins are going to catch fish because that's all they do all the time.
But I mean, like, we can learn some cool things from animal biology, right? Like the fact that like
of course,
you can have like, I think it's like clownfish, or there's like certain other like, I know that there's actually like several species that can do this. Like, there are certain species that can literally just in the course of like their individual lifetime can just like change their sex or their reproductive function. Like, they can just do that shit. Like in the like through a rapid kind of process, right? And there are lots of animals who have like very, you know, like very different kind of like biological reproductive qualities than most other animals. Like platypus is an easy example, right? Where they have like some crazy shit going on that's just unlike anything else that we are able to observe in like in our world, right? That's not necessarily to say that like, you know, we should assume the same kind of qualities that you talked about onto those organisms, but they could help to be able to demonstrate that, like, listen, you know, a lot of these qualities that we're trying to talk about are not as simple as people make them out to be. And like, just, you know, and being able to look at the ways that they manifest in other animals are able to show that, like, you know, there's a greater variety of ways that these kind of qualities can manifest in other people, or not in other people, in other species on our planet. Oh yeah, frog. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Like, have you ever heard the meme, or are you familiar with the Alex Jones meme?
I'm very
water.
Familiar.
Yeah, the water will turn the frickin' frogs gay. So apparently that shit's based on like some real shit. It's funny because like we all like
no way, that's the first.
Yeah. No, there's a video, there's like a documentary that was circulating on YouTube, and I watched it a little bit ago. If someone else can pull it up, then you can go watch it on your own. But essentially, it talks about the fact that, like, yeah, he sounded crazy, and, like, this meme just, like, blew massively out of proportion and kind of made it look absurd. But then some people explored the fact that actually there were some certain, I think it was, like, agricultural companies that were polluting water, that were polluting, like, local waterways heavily with certain kind of chemicals that ended up having the adverse effect of, like, highly feminizing a lot of the frogs there. Like even to the
insane.
point where some of them like straight up either like developed both types of reproductive functions or like just straight up changed their biological sex, right? Like some
Wow.
crazy shit. And so like that's I mean, like on one part that's kind of scary because it does kind of make you wonder, like, oh shit, are there a lot of people out there who have just been like drinking highly like forced feminization water for half their lives, and that might be like why we have a lot of people out. I don't know. You get into some weird questions there.
Yeah,
But like
for sure.
also it does show that like there are organisms. Like I believe that frogs are the easiest example to observe this in, just because like they have certain qualities that make it so like they can have really rapid bodily effects to what do you call it? To like certain changes of their environment over the course of their life. Again, if people want to cite me the accurate science on that, then you're more than welcome to. I'm just doing this the best I can from memory. But I mean, like, that's just another example to be able to show that, like, listen, like, even in organisms where it's not necessarily normal, being exposed to certain kinds of external effects can have some crazy effects, like changing biological sex just in the course of one lifetime, right? And I think it just it goes to show kind of the the fact that this is a subject matter or an area where we definitely don't have a full understanding of like all of its qualities, right? Because like the logical extension of that is, oh, if you're able to change the sex of a frog over the course of one lifetime just by being exposed to a type of a chemical in the wild, then like is it possible to be able to do that for people, right? Like, is it possible to be able to take it so like you can take a pill and it'll just like do you had a penis, well now you have a JJ, and you can do the reproducing. Like, is
Right.
that possible, right? And we don't know that fully, but like we at least know that like it's conceivable because we've observed it otherwise in nature. So yeah, like
Right.
I don't know if that necessarily goes to answer your question. Like obviously it doesn't, like these things don't necessarily apply directly to humans, but they open the door for other areas of exploration that people may have not thought to exist prior, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It definitely is insightful.